Part 1. Clarence Hayes in jail. The call for help. The cold concrete floor of the jail cell pressed against Clarence Hayes's knees as he knelt, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. His breathing was steady, but the sting above his brow told him all he needed to know. Blood trickled from a fresh cut, a gift from Officer Jake Reynolds, who now leaned casually against the bars, smirking. "You've got one phone call, old man," Reynolds sneered, his voice laced with mockery. "Not that it'll change a damn thing." Clarence said nothing at first, his gaze locked on the rusted bolts in the floor. He had spent a lifetime learning when to fight back and when to endure. It was a skill honed through years of quiet resistance, of knowing that, in a town like Bridgetown, justice was nothing more than a word spoken by men who never truly understood it. Men like Reynolds, whose authority came not from honor, but from generations of unchecked power. Clarence flexed his fingers, feeling the bite of the steel cuffs against his wrists. He could taste the metallic tang of blood in his mouth from where Reynolds had struck him. He had been through worse. 1,000 nights in the jungles of Vietnam had taught him what real fear looked like. This wasn't fear. This was familiarity. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his head, locking eyes with Reynolds. There was no anger in his expression, no desperation, just the quiet, unwavering defiance of a man who had faced down death before and walked away. "I don't need a lawyer," Clarence said evenly. Reynolds let out a short laugh. "That's so. You finally accepted your fate, huh?" Clarence didn't answer. Instead, he shifted slightly, rolling his shoulders against the aching tension in his muscles, then spoke 2 words that sent a ripple through the room. "I'll call my son." Reynolds's smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second. It was barely noticeable, but Clarence saw it. He always saw it, the moment when arrogance collided with uncertainty, when men like Reynolds realized they might not be as untouchable as they thought. "Your son?" Reynolds scoffed, but there was something different in his tone now. A hesitation. "And what's he gonna do? Cry to the state board? Call the NAACP? Newsflash, old man. This ain't a fairy tale. There's no cavalry coming for you." Clarence's gaze didn't waver. He knew better than anyone that justice didn't arrive wrapped in banners or led by men in polished suits. It was fought for, earned, and sometimes taken back by force when the system refused to give it freely. He nodded toward the phone mounted on the wall. "You gonna uncuff me, or do I make the call like this?" Reynolds hesitated, but eventually let out a huff of irritation before unlocking the cuffs. Clarence stood, rubbing his wrists briefly before stepping toward the phone. He lifted the receiver with steady hands, dialed a number he had memorized long ago, and waited. 1 ring, 2, 3. Then a voice, low and controlled, colder than steel. "Dad." Clarence exhaled slowly, his chest tightening, not with fear, but with the weight of knowing what came next. They have no idea what they've just started. And just like that, the game had changed. Reynolds watched with a smug grin, oblivious to the storm that had just been set in motion. To him, Clarence was just another old black man who didn't know his place, another name on a long list of people the system had broken. But he didn't know about Eric. He didn't know that Clarence's son was not the kind of man who begged for justice. He was the kind who made sure it was delivered. As Clarence hung up the phone, he turned back to Reynolds, meeting his gaze with a look that was calm, steady, but unmistakably resolute. "You picked the wrong man, son," Clarence said quietly. Reynolds rolled his eyes. "Yeah, we'll see about that." But deep down, even if he wouldn't admit it yet, something in the back of Reynolds' mind was whispering a warning. A storm was coming, and this time, it wouldn't be one they could control. Eric Hayes had always been a man of purpose. His father had raised him that way. From the moment he was old enough to understand the world around him, Clarence had instilled in him the belief that a man's worth wasn't measured by the obstacles he faced, but by how he stood against them. And now, standing on a tarmac at an undisclosed military base, Eric's mind was already 10 steps ahead, calculating, planning. He had heard the tension in his father's voice, the restrained fury. Clarence Hayes was not a man who called for help. That alone told Eric everything he needed to know. He turned sharply toward his second-in-command, Captain Leo Martinez, who was jogging toward him with a concerned look. "Mission parameters changed?" Martinez asked. Eric nodded once. "Bridgetown, Alabama. My father's been arrested." Martinez frowned. "You think it's legit?" Eric's jaw clenched. "Number, I think it's a message." Martinez exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You sure about this?" "We were supposed to mobilize for a classified op in Anara in 48 hours. Anara can wait." Eric's voice was firm, final. "Family comes first." Martinez studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Understood. What's the play?" Eric didn't hesitate. "We do what we do best. Gather intel, identify the players, disrupt their operation. We move fast, we move quiet, and when we strike, we make damn sure they never forget it." He turned, striding toward the aircraft waiting on the runway. Martinez followed, already barking orders into his comm. As the engines roared to life, Eric stared out into the distance, his thoughts sharpening into one singular focus. Bridgetown thought they could take his father down. They had no idea who they were up against. They were about to find out. Part 2. Eric Hayes, The Phantom Awakens. Clarence Hayes sat on the edge of the narrow bench in the holding cell, his wrists aching from the cold iron cuffs that had only recently been removed. The room smelled of damp concrete and the lingering stench of old sweat, the kind of place meant to break a man down before he ever saw the inside of a courtroom. But Clarence had spent his life in places meant to break him, and he was still standing. His mind wasn't on the bruises that throbbed beneath his ribs, or the cut above his brow that still wept blood. He had endured pain before, worse than this. His thoughts drifted further back to the road that had led him here. This wasn't just about a wrongful arrest. This was about something bigger, something older than Jake Reynolds, older than Bridgetown's corrupt system. This was about history. A history that had been written long before he was born, one that men like Reynolds had inherited, like an ugly family heirloom. Clarence knew that standing tall came with a price. He had learned that as a boy growing up in the Deep South, where the rules of survival were never spoken aloud, but were as clear as the air on a hot summer day. His father had been a proud man, but he had known when to bow his head, when to keep his mouth shut. He had done what he had to do to keep his family fed, even if it meant swallowing his pride. But Clarence had never been good at swallowing anything that didn't sit right in his gut. He could still hear his mother's voice in his mind, soft and tired, whispering to him at night as she tucked him into bed, warning him to be careful. "This world ain't built for men like you, baby," she had said. "You can fight all you want, but just know that fightin' don't always mean winnin'." She had cleaned houses for white families who barely acknowledged her presence, working herself to the bone so Clarence could have a shot at something better. And he had tried. Lord, he had tried. At 18, he had enlisted in the Army, desperate to prove himself in a country that refused to see him as its own. Vietnam had changed him. He had seen men die with honor, and he had seen men die for nothing at all. He had earned medals, commendations, proof that he was worth something, at least to the military. But when he came home, stepping off the bus in Bridgetown, the stares of the men on Main Street told him all he needed to know. He was still just another black man in a town that hadn't changed. He had walked the same streets he had left behind, past the same diners where he had once been told to take his food to go, past the same bank that had laughed in his face when he first tried to get a loan. It wasn't until Sam Redding, a fellow veteran, a white man who had fought beside him, co-signed the papers that he was finally able to buy a small plot of land on the edge of town. Even then, the building inspector had found every excuse to slow him down. But Clarence didn't break. He built Hayes Auto Repair with his own two hands, brick by brick, bolt by bolt. For over 40 years, that shop had been his pride, his proof that no matter what they threw at him, he could carve out his own piece of the world. It wasn't just a garage. It was a legacy. A place where he had raised his son, Eric, after Janine had passed too soon, breast cancer taking her before they ever had a chance to grow old together. Clarence had mourned quietly, drowning his grief in late nights at the shop and whispered prayers over his sleeping son. Eric had grown up watching his father fight battles in silence, learning lessons Clarence hadn't even meant to teach. Never bow to a bully, Clarence had told him more times than he could count. You give 'em an inch, they'll take your whole damn soul. Maybe Eric had listened too well. He had joined the military like his father before him, but where Clarence had gone to prove himself, Eric had gone to become something greater. He had climbed the ranks with a relentless drive that left even his superiors in awe. The name Phantom had followed him, whispered in the shadows by men who understood what it meant. A ghost on the battlefield, a man who never lost. Clarence had been proud, but he had also been afraid, because he knew men like Eric, men who refused to yield, never lived easy lives. They either carved their own way or were buried beneath the weight of the world trying. And now, as Clarence sat in this cell, feeling the bruises form beneath his skin, he knew that Eric wasn't the kind of man who would sit still when the people he loved were threatened. He had made a call, and now the storm was coming. The night pressed in around him, heavy and unrelenting. From the small barred window, Clarence could see the glow of the streetlights beyond the station. He imagined Eric, already moving like a shadow through the dark, closing in on the town that had wronged his father. He imagined Reynolds smirking to himself, thinking he had already won. The fools didn't realize that Clarence had survived men far worse than them. He had faced down soldiers in the jungle, had watched men bleed out in the dirt with nothing but prayers on their lips. He had built something from nothing, had fought battles in courtrooms and town halls and places where no one had seen the fight except him. And now, they thought they could take everything from him with a badge and a sneer. Clarence flexed his fingers, feeling the stiffness in his knuckles, the years of hard work etched into his skin. He had built a life with these hands. He had held his wife's hand as she took her last breath. He had carried his sleeping son from the shop to the house on nights when he had fallen asleep waiting for his father to finish just one more job. And now, with nothing left but the fight in his heart, he clenched his fists and smiled. Because if there was one thing Clarence Hayes knew for certain, it was this: you don't pick a fight with a man who has nothing left to lose. The Phantom was coming home, and Bridgetown wasn't ready. Part 3. The Corrupt Officer's Threat. Clarence Hayes stood outside Hayes Auto Repair, his hands planted on his hips as he stared at the crude message scrawled across the garage door. The red paint dripped down in uneven streaks, the words slashing across the worn blue like a wound torn open for the world to see. Know your place. The early morning light had yet to chase away the darkness, but Clarence didn't need daylight to understand the message. He had seen it before, in different forms, through different faces. It had been in the sneers of bank managers when they denied his loan application. It had been in the random inspections that had always seemed to find fault with his business. It had been in the eyes of Officer Jake Reynolds just a few days ago, when he had walked into the shop with that thin, practiced smile and offered Clarence a choice disguised as a favor. It was never about crime, never about safety. It was about control. Clarence had refused, and this was the price. Glass crunched beneath his boots as he stepped forward. The front window had been shattered, the jagged edges reflecting the early light like teeth. The air smelled of oil and damp concrete, the scent of his life's work now tainted with the stench of destruction. Inside, it was worse. Tires slashed, toolboxes overturned. The coffee can he kept by the register, filled with small bills and change for customers who came up short, was kicked across the floor, its contents scattered like breadcrumbs leading to the truth. This wasn't just vandalism. This was a message, a warning. Clarence didn't need to guess who was behind it. Jake Reynolds had made himself clear when he had strolled in last week, feigning concern over rising crime in the neighborhood. Clarence had met plenty of men like him before. Men who pretended their hatred was about something else. Men who cleaned up their threats with fancy words and official paperwork. Reynolds had leaned against the counter, tapping his fingers absently against the polished wood as he spoke. You know, Mr. Hayes, a place like this could use a little security. Bridgetown's not what it used to be. Businesses like yours, well, they can become targets. Clarence had wiped the grease from his hands and met Reynolds's gaze head-on. You mean targets for folks who don't like seeing a black man own something they think he shouldn't? Reynolds had smirked, unfazed. You misunderstand. It's just a little neighborhood fund. Keep things safe. Keep the right people looking out for you. Clarence had let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening around the rag in his hands. I served this country, he said, voice steady. I don't pay cowards for protection. The shift in Reynolds's face had been subtle, a twitch in his jaw, a flicker of something colder in his eyes. Suit yourself, Hayes, he had said smoothly. Just don't say we didn't offer you a chance to stay safe. Now, standing in the ruins of his shop, Clarence knew exactly what that chance had been. He reached for the old rotary phone on the counter, but his hand hovered over the receiver. Calling the police was pointless. He could already see how it would play out. Some young rookie would come down, take a few photos, jot down some notes. Maybe he'd even seem sympathetic. But then the report would sit in a drawer, collecting dust, until it disappeared altogether. This fight wasn't going to be won in a police station. He turned and walked out, the morning sun rising just enough to cast a long shadow behind him. By the time he reached City Hall, the receptionist's polite smile faltered the moment he said his name. I need to speak to someone about my business being targeted, Clarence said, voice firm but calm. The woman hesitated, glancing down at something on her desk. Maybe a memo, maybe nothing at all. I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes, she said, suddenly avoiding his gaze. Your permits are under review. You'll need to wait for the official inspection report. Clarence exhaled slowly. Inspection report? The woman nodded. Bridgetown Health Department. They're citing possible violations, expired permits, improper storage of hazardous materials. Until those are cleared up, your business will have to remain closed. Clarence felt something cold settle in his chest. This was the next step, the next move in a game he had never agreed to play. That evening, Reynolds returned. This time, he didn't bother pretending. He strolled into the ruined shop, hands in his pockets, eyes sweeping lazily over the mess his people had made. Shame about the break-in, he drawled, running a hand along the hood of an unfinished truck. This neighborhood's getting rough. Clarence didn't answer. Reynolds tilted his head slightly. But you know, Mr. Hayes, these things, they don't have to happen. You put a little in the right pockets, and suddenly, all these problems just go away. Clarence wiped his hands on his rag and looked Reynolds square in the eye. Go to hell. The smile slipped from Reynolds' face, replaced with something colder. Wrong answer. 3 days later, they came back with more than threats. A health inspector, flanked by 2 officers, stood outside the shop with a clipboard and a smirk. After a thorough review, he announced, far too loudly, Hayes Auto Repair has been deemed non-compliant with multiple safety regulations. Effective immediately, the business is to be shut down pending further investigation. Reynolds was standing across the street, arms crossed, watching. Clarence clenched his fists. He had faced real enemies in the jungles of Vietnam, men who believed in something, even if they were on the other side of the battlefield. But men like Reynolds, they fought for nothing but power, and power didn't like being challenged. That night, the alarm system blared at 2 a.m. Clarence was already awake when it happened. He had felt it coming, the way an old soldier feels a storm before it breaks. He ran outside, heart pounding, only to find the shop gutted. Windows shattered, oil poured across the floor, tools scattered like confetti. Spray painted across the back wall was a single word: last warning. The real gut punch came when he found the envelope pinned to the garage door. Inside was an official-looking letterhead from the Bridgetown Police Department. Notice of seizure. They were taking the shop. Citing suspected involvement in illicit activity, the document claimed the city had the right to seize the property under civil asset forfeiture. Clarence staggered back, the weight of it all pressing against his ribs like a vice. This wasn't just about money. They were erasing him. His father's voice echoed in his mind. words spoken long ago on the front porch of their old house. You bow to a bully once, you'll be on your knees forever. Clarence Hayes had bowed to no one in his life. He wasn't about to start now. That night, he made a phone call. The screen lit up, the number familiar but distant. 3 rings, then a voice, cold as steel. "Stay put, Dad," Eric said. "They have no idea what they've just started." Clarence exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the phone. Hope was a dangerous thing, but right now it was the only weapon he had left. Part 4. The shop's vandalism. A warning. The cold concrete floor of the jail cell pressed against Clarence Hayes' knees as he knelt, hands cuffed behind his back. Blood trickled from a cut above his brow, courtesy of Officer Jake Reynolds, who now leaned casually against the cell bars, smirking. "One phone call, old man," Reynolds sneered. "Not that it'll change anything." Clarence didn't respond. He wasn't going to give Reynolds the satisfaction of a reaction. The officer was enjoying this moment too much, savoring the sight of a man he had spent years trying to break, now locked behind bars. But Clarence had made his call, and that was all that mattered. 3 rings. Then a voice, colder than steel, answered. "Stay put, Dad," Eric had said. "They have no idea what they've just started." Reynolds chuckled, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "You think your boy's going to come save you? No one's coming, Hayes. You don't run this town. You never did." Clarence finally lifted his head, fixing Reynolds with a calm, unwavering stare. "I never needed to run it. I just needed to survive it." Reynolds' smirk faltered, but before he could respond, the steel door at the end of the hallway swung open. The sound of boots against tile echoed through the station, measured and deliberate. A hush fell over the other officers in the room. Eric Hayes had arrived. Dressed in dark civilian clothes, his build lean and powerful, Eric moved with the quiet precision of a man who had spent years navigating battlefields. He wasn't here to start a fight. He was here to finish one. The desk sergeant, a weary man with graying hair, stood to intercept him. "Mr. Hayes, this is a restricted—" "Colonel," Eric corrected, his voice clipped. "Colonel Eric Hayes, United States Army, and I'm here for my father." Reynolds straightened, stepping forward with his usual arrogance. "Well, well, the famous son. You think that title means anything here?" Eric's eyes never left Reynolds as he pulled a folded document from his jacket. "This is a federal injunction ordering my father's immediate release, signed by a judge who doesn't take kindly to civil rights violations. So, unless you want to explain to the Department of Justice why you illegally detained a decorated veteran on fabricated charges, I suggest you unlock that cell, now." Reynolds snatched the paper, scanning it quickly, his jaw tightening. "This is bullshit." "That's funny," Eric said, voice dangerously calm. "So was the charge you made up to put him in here." The room was silent. The tension thickened as Reynolds flicked his gaze toward the other officers, looking for support. But no one spoke. No one moved. The weight of what was happening had begun to sink in. Reynolds wasn't just dealing with Clarence Hayes anymore. He was dealing with something far bigger, something he couldn't control. The keys clinked as they were removed from Reynolds' belt. The cell door swung open. Clarence rose to his feet, rubbing his wrists as the cuffs fell away. His son stood before him, calm but rigid, his gaze unreadable. "You okay, Dad?" Eric asked quietly. Clarence nodded. "I will be." Eric turned back to Reynolds. "This isn't over." Reynolds scoffed, trying to regain his bravado. "What are you going to do? File a complaint? Sue us? Good luck proving anything." Eric tilted his head slightly. "Who said anything about proving it?" Reynolds frowned. Eric stepped forward, lowering his voice so only Reynolds could hear. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? You think a badge makes you invincible. But the thing about power is, it only lasts as long as people let it. And I promise you, Reynolds, your time just ran out." For the first time, there was hesitation in Reynolds' eyes, a flicker of something that might have been fear. Eric didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked his father out of the station, their steps steady, unhurried. Outside, the night air was cool against Clarence's bruised skin. The stars above Bridgetown twinkled like indifferent witnesses to all that had transpired. Eric led his father to the waiting SUV, the doors shut with a quiet finality. "Where to?" Clarence asked, adjusting his seatbelt. Eric's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Somewhere we can make sure this never happens again." Clarence exhaled, nodding. He had spent his entire life standing his ground, refusing to be pushed out of the place he had built. But for the first time he realized this wasn't just his fight anymore. It never had been. The next morning, the town woke to headlines they never expected. Veteran business owner unlawfully arrested. Federal investigation launched into Bridgetown PD. The footage had spread overnight. The video taken from the holding cell's security cameras had somehow found its way to the public. It showed everything: the arrest, the fabricated charges, the bruises on Clarence's face. The outrage was immediate. The town divided into two camps: those who had long known the truth about their police department and those who could no longer deny it. City officials scrambled for damage control. The mayor held an emergency press conference promising an internal review. But the people weren't interested in words anymore. They wanted action. By noon, Reynolds was suspended pending investigation. By evening, an independent oversight committee was announced. And by nightfall, something else had begun to shift. Fear. For years, Bridgetown had operated under an unspoken rule. Power belonged to those who had always held it. But now, that power was cracking. People were talking. Business owners who had once paid into Reynolds' protection fund were coming forward with their own stories. City Hall's phone lines were jammed with calls from residents demanding accountability. The foundation of corruption that had seemed so unshakable was beginning to crumble. And at the center of it all stood Clarence and Eric Hayes. They didn't ask for this fight, but they weren't going to walk away from it either. That evening, as the sun dipped low over Bridgetown, Clarence stood in the doorway of his repaired shop, watching his son lean against the hood of a car, arms crossed, deep in thought. "You really think this is going to change anything?" Clarence asked, his voice quiet. Eric turned his head slightly. "It already has." Clarence let out a slow breath. Maybe his son was right. Maybe this was just the beginning. He placed a hand on Eric's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had brought them to this moment. "Whatever happens next," Clarence said, "we don't back down." Eric nodded, his eyes scanning the street, the town, the future that was unfolding in ways no one had predicted. "No, Dad," he said, "we don't." Some battles were fought in jungles and deserts, others were fought in courtrooms and city halls, but the hardest battles, the ones that shaped history, were fought in the places people called home. Bridgetown wasn't just a town anymore. It was a battlefield. And the Hayes family had just fired the first shot. Part 5. The Midnight Attack. Retaliation begins. Clarence Hayes stood in front of his shop, his hands resting on his hips as he stared at the message scrawled across the garage door in bold, dripping red paint. "Know your place." The words stood out like a wound against the faded blue of the building, a cruel reminder that no matter how much time passed, no matter how many battles he fought, some people still believed they had the right to tell him where he belonged. The bitter scent of spray paint clung to the cool morning air. Shattered glass crunched beneath his boots as he stepped forward. His gaze traveled across the wreckage. Tires slashed, toolboxes overturned, the cash register pried open and emptied. Inside, the damage was worse. Oil had been poured across the floor, expensive diagnostic equipment smashed beyond repair. The coffee can where Clarence kept spare change for customers lay discarded on the ground, its contents scattered like loose teeth after a beating. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. He had seen worse. He had survived worse. But that didn't make it hurt any less. Clarence already knew who was behind this. Officer Jake Reynolds had made it clear after their last encounter. This was his town, his rules. And anyone who didn't fall in line? They were made to pay. Clarence took a deep breath and pulled out his phone. Not because he expected justice, but because he needed this on record. He dialed the police station, knowing exactly what kind of response he would get. "Bridgetown PD, what's your emergency?" Clarence steadied his voice. "This is Clarence Hayes. My shop was vandalized overnight. Need an officer to file a report." There was a pause, the kind that lasted just long enough to send a clear message. "All right, Mr. Hayes," the dispatcher finally said, her tone clipped. "We'll send someone when we can." Clarence exhaled through his nose, the familiar weight of frustration settling in his chest. He knew exactly what that meant. Maybe an officer would show up in a few hours. Maybe not. And if they did, it wouldn't be to help. It would be to remind him, yet again, that men like him weren't meant to win in a place like this. But he wasn't about to let that stop him. An hour later, a squad car pulled up, and out stepped Officer Brian Lacey. A rookie. One of the few on the force who still had the look of someone who believed in the badge. Lacey took one look at the destruction and let out a quiet sigh. "Damn, Mr. Hayes," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "This looks bad." Clarence crossed his arms. "It is bad." Lacey nodded and pulled out his notepad. "You got any idea who might have done this?" Clarence let out a dry chuckle. "You're asking me, officer? Or are you just seeing if I'll say the name you're already thinking?" Lacey hesitated, glancing toward the street. Across the road, parked near the corner with a cup of coffee in his hand, was Reynolds, sitting in his patrol car, watching. Clarence didn't need to turn around to know he was there. He could feel it. Lacey cleared his throat. "Look, Mr. Hayes, I'll file the report, but—" He hesitated, lowering his voice. "You know how things work around here." Clarence's jaw tightened. "Yeah, I know exactly how they work." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "The question is, do you—" Lacey's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Maybe guilt. Maybe fear. Clarence didn't say another word. He didn't have to. Lacey finished scribbling in his notepad, muttered something about getting the report submitted, and walked back to his car. Across the street, Reynolds raised his coffee cup in a mock toast before driving off, leaving behind nothing but the faint stench of burnt coffee and arrogance. Clarence stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space where Reynolds' car had been. Then he turned back to his shop, rolled up his sleeves, and got to work. Because that's what he did. That's what he had always done. By the end of the day, the glass was swept, the oil mopped up, and the equipment, what could be salvaged, was back where it belonged. The only thing he hadn't touched was the garage door. The red letters still dripped down the metal like fresh blood. A warning. A threat. But Clarence wasn't going to paint over it. Not yet. Let them see it. Let the whole damn town see what they tried to do. That night, as he locked up, his phone buzzed. A message from his son. "Eric. Heard what happened. I'm coming home." Clarence exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the phone. He knew what that meant. Eric didn't make empty promises, and when he came back to town, there wouldn't be any warnings. The next morning, Clarence arrived at his shop early, but he wasn't the only one. A small crowd had gathered outside. Customers, neighbors, friends, even people who had never spoken to him before. They stood in silence, looking at the words on his garage door. Then, one by one, they stepped forward. A woman from down the street handed him a fresh can of blue paint. A local mechanic, one who had once been too scared to speak out, pressed a roll of cash into his hand. "For repairs," he muttered before walking away. And then, something unexpected happened. A young man, barely out of high school, took a rag, dipped it in paint thinner, and started scrubbing the letters away. Clarence watched as more people joined in. No one spoke. No one had to. By the time the sun was fully up, the words were gone. But something more powerful had been left in their place. A message of its own. Clarence wasn't alone. And Bridgetown? It wasn't just Reynolds' town anymore. That night, as Clarence sat on his porch, a black SUV pulled into the driveway. The door opened, and Eric stepped out, his expression unreadable as he took in his father's bruised face, the stiffness in his movements. "You good?" Eric asked quietly. Clarence nodded. "I will be." Eric's gaze shifted toward the shop, toward the spot where the message had been. He didn't ask what had happened. He already knew. But what Clarence saw in his son's eyes wasn't anger. It was something colder, more controlled. Reynolds had made a mistake. He had tried to break a man who had already survived worse. And now, the fight wasn't just about Clarence. Now, it was about something bigger. Because when you tried to tear down a man who had built himself from nothing, you had better be ready for what happened when he decided to fight back. Part 6. The Kidnapping of Tanya Reed, a line crossed. Clarence Hayes had spent his life building something that couldn't be taken away. Brick by brick, bolt by bolt, he had poured everything into Hayes Auto Repair, not just as a business but as a legacy, a place that stood for something bigger than himself. It wasn't just about fixing cars. It was about proving a black man could carve out his own space in a town that had tried, over and over, to keep him small. But power doesn't like to be challenged, and men like Officer Jake Reynolds thrived on making sure people like Clarence knew their place. 3 days after his shop was ransacked, the next blow came, and this time, it wasn't hidden behind the shadows of the night. Clarence was under the hood of a Chevy when he heard the heavy footsteps. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Officer Reynolds strolled into the shop like he owned it, flanked by 2 other officers, Frank Delaney and Corey Mills, men cut from the same cloth. Their smiles were too wide, their uniforms crisp and clean, badges shining under the fluorescent lights. Clarence wiped his hands on a rag and exhaled slowly before turning to face them. "Morning, gentlemen," he said evenly. Reynolds grinned, running a hand along the hood of an unfinished Ford pickup. "Shame about the break-in, Hayes," he said, voice dripping with mock concern. "This neighborhood's not what it used to be." Clarence folded his arms. "No, it's not." Reynolds tilted his head. "You know, a man in your position, well, he's got to think about things. Long-term security. Protection." There it was. No need to dress it up. No need for pretense. Clarence held his gaze, steady as stone. "I don't need your protection." Reynolds' smile tightened, just enough to show the cracks beneath the surface. "No?" he said softly, tapping his knuckles against the truck. "Well, you might want to reconsider." Clarence didn't blink. He had faced real enemies before, men who didn't hide behind uniforms or legal loopholes. This question mark. This was nothing more than a cheap intimidation act. "I serve this country," Clarence said, his voice calm but firm. "I don't pay cowards for protection." For a split second, something dark flashed across Reynolds' face. Then the grin returned, sharper this time. "Suit yourself, Hayes," he said, stepping back. "Just don't say we didn't offer you a chance to stay safe." Clarence watched them leave, his chest tight with the knowledge of what was coming next. That night, he barely slept. At 2 a.m., the alarm system blared, ripping him from restless dreams. He was out of bed in an instant, heart pounding, reaching for the shotgun he kept by the door. By the time he made it to the shop, he already knew what he was about to find. The windows were shattered. The garage door had been pried open. Inside, it was worse than before. Ripped out wiring, oil dumped across the floor, every piece of equipment overturned or smashed. Spray painted across the back wall was a single word: last warning. But it wasn't just about destruction. This was a message. Then Clarence saw the envelope pinned to the garage door. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. Official-looking letterhead. The words made his stomach turn. Bridgetown Police Department notice of seizure. They were taking his shop. They had cited him for multiple violations. Faulty wiring, expired permits, hazardous waste disposal. None of it true. None of it mattered. Clarence staggered back, the paper shaking in his hands. This wasn't about money. It was about erasing him. His father's voice echoed in his head. A lesson learned too young. "You bow to a bully once, you'll be on your knees forever." The next morning, Clarence marched down to City Hall, the paper gripped so tight in his fist it crumpled. The receptionist barely glanced up when he walked in. "I need to speak to someone about this," he said, slapping the notice on the counter. The woman behind the desk picked it up, skimmed it, and then gave him the kind of look people reserved for lost causes. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, avoiding his gaze. "Your permits are under review. You'll need to wait for the official inspection report." Clarence clenched his jaw. "How long?" She hesitated. Then, too softly, "Weeks. Maybe months." He exhaled slowly, pressing his palms against the counter. "You and I both know what this is." The receptionist swallowed hard, her lips parting like she wanted to say something else. But in the end, she just looked away. Clarence turned and walked out, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. By the time he got back to the shop, Reynolds was already there. This time, he wasn't alone. Frank Delaney and Corey Mills flanked him again, but now they held clipboards, pretending to conduct an inspection. It was a joke, a performance. Reynolds smiled wide. "Looks like you've got some serious violations here, Hayes," Delaney said, tapping a pipe. "Unsafe work environment, potential environmental hazards. We're going to have to shut you down until these are fixed." Clarence's blood boiled. "You think I don't see what this is?" His voice was like steel. Extortion with a badge. Reynolds' smile never wavered. "Big words," he said, pulling out a pink slip. "But all I see is an official closure notice." He held it up like a trophy. "You want to reopen?" Reynolds continued. $5,000 to the Bridgetown Neighborhood Safety Fund." His smirk sharpened. "Otherwise, this place stays locked up." Clarence took a slow breath, steadying himself. Then, with measured control, he said the only thing left to say. "Go to hell." Reynolds' smile disappeared. Wrong answer. That night, they came back. This time, they weren't looking for money. At 3 a.m., Clarence woke to the sound of splintering wood, a crash, then the sound of heavy boots moving through the shop. He grabbed his shotgun, heart hammering. By the time he got there, it was too late. They had gutted the place. Every last piece of machinery was gone. The back door had been ripped off its hinges, and on the ground, in the center of it all, lay a single folded envelope. Inside, another note. "You should have taken the deal." Clarence sank into a chair, staring at the wreckage of his life's work. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was war. The next morning, as he stood in the ruins of what used to be his shop, he made a call. The phone rang once, twice, then a voice. Calm, cold, steady. "Dad." Clarence exhaled slowly, gripping the phone tighter. "They came for the shop, took everything. It's worse than I thought." A pause, then just 2 words. "I'm coming." Clarence closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling with something that felt like relief. Because if Eric was coming home, Bridgetown was about to learn a lesson they wouldn't forget. Part 7. Eric's silent takedown of the Mercenaries. Eric Hayes had always known his father was a fighter. He had seen it in the way Clarence built Hayes Auto Repair from nothing, in the way he stood tall even when the town tried to force him to kneel. But this was different. This wasn't just about fighting to keep his shop. This was about survival. This was war. The moment Eric stepped off the plane, he could feel it in the air. Bridgetown had always been a town of unspoken rules, of lines you weren't supposed to cross. And Clarence Hayes had crossed too many of them. He had refused to pay for protection. He had refused to bow to power. And now, the system was trying to erase him. Eric had seen this kind of corruption before, just not on American soil. In the military, he had spent years fighting against regimes that used fear to control people. He had taken down warlords who thrived on intimidation, dismantled entire networks of corruption that had festered for decades. But he never thought he'd have to fight that battle in his own hometown. The airport was quiet when he arrived. No fanfare, no welcoming committee. Just the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant chatter of travelers moving to destinations that had nothing to do with him. That was fine. He didn't need an audience. He just needed a target. His first stop wasn't home. It wasn't even the shop. It was information. He rented a car under an alias, paid in cash, and drove straight to an old friend, one of the few people in Bridgetown who hadn't been bought. Officer Brian Lacey. Lacey was young, new to the force, still naive enough to believe in the badge he wore. Eric had done his homework. Lacey had tried to report Reynolds before, had even pushed for an internal investigation. But that investigation had gone nowhere, buried under paperwork and politics. Eric found him sitting in his patrol car outside a 24-hour diner, staring at a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold an hour ago. He knocked once on the driver's side window. Lacey flinched but relaxed when he recognized him. "Phantom Hayes," Lacey muttered, shaking his head. "Didn't think I'd ever see you back here." Eric slid into the passenger seat without waiting for an invitation. "Didn't think I'd have to come back." Lacey exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "I heard what happened to your dad. Reynolds isn't even trying to hide it anymore." "That's because he thinks no one's coming for him," Eric said evenly. "That changes now." Lacey gave him a sideways glance. "You planning to go through official channels?" Eric let out a humorless laugh. "You tell me, officer. What have official channels done for my father?" Silence. Lacey looked away, shaking his head. "You've got two options," Eric continued. "You can pretend you don't see what's happening, or you can help me end it." Lacey hesitated, then reached into his glove compartment and pulled out a flash drive. "This is everything I've been collecting. Body cam footage, falsified reports, internal memos from Burke's office. It's not enough to bring them down yet, but it's a start." Eric took the drive, tucking it into his jacket. "Then let's finish it." Lacey's voice dropped to a whisper. "You should know. Reynolds isn't just playing muscle anymore. Burke is moving pieces. They know you're coming." Eric nodded. "Let them." He left Lacey in the patrol car, his coffee still untouched. He had what he needed. Now it was time to make his presence known. The first place he went was the shop. Clarence was waiting. His father had aged, but not in the way that made a man weaker. The lines on his face were deeper. The weight of too many battles settled in his eyes, but his posture was the same. Unyielding. "You look like hell," Eric said, stepping inside the wreckage of Hayes Auto Repair. Clarence huffed. "And you look like you're about to start a war." Eric glanced around at the destruction. "You call it starting a war. I call it finishing one." His father sighed, rubbing his temple. "Son, this isn't like the battles you fought before. This town, it doesn't run on laws. It runs on favors. It runs on men who think they own the ground we walk on. Then it's time to remind them they don't." Clarence studied his son for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right, but we do this smart. You got a plan?" Eric smirked. "I always have a plan." He spent the next 12 hours setting the board. This wasn't just about getting revenge. That would be easy. Too easy. He wasn't here to throw punches in the dark. He was here to dismantle the entire machine. First, he hacked into Bridgetown PD's internal system. It was laughably outdated. Within minutes, he had access to emails, surveillance footage, and payroll records that showed exactly how deep the corruption ran. Next, he tapped into local traffic cameras. He mapped out Reynolds' patrol routes, found the weak points, the moments when he was most vulnerable. Then, he made a call. Maya Reynolds, no relation to Jake, was his old contact at the Department of Justice. She had been trying to crack Bridgetown for years, but had never had enough evidence to make a case. Now, Eric was about to hand it to her on a silver platter. "This is big," Maya said after scanning the files he sent. "Bigger than just Burke and Reynolds. You sure you're ready for this?" Eric's voice was cold. "They went after my father. There's no walking away." Maya sighed. "All right, but be careful. Men like Burke don't fall quietly. Neither do I." The first move was simple. Let them know he was back. That night, Reynolds found his patrol car stripped of every wire, every bolt. Sitting in the driver's seat was a single note. "I'm here." The next morning, Burke's office was flooded with emails from anonymous sources, files exposing every deal he had made, every business he had extorted. He wasn't in trouble yet, but the paranoia was enough to shake him. And then, the final touch. A video. Sent to every local news outlet. A compilation of body cam footage, police reports, and internal memos. Proof that Bridgetown PD was running a racket. Proof that Burke and Reynolds were at the center of it. The town woke up to the truth. Burke reacted exactly as Eric expected. He locked down. He pulled strings, made calls. But it was too late. The people were watching now, and Eric wasn't done. By the time the sun set, Reynolds was scrambling. He had built his power on fear, but fear only worked when people believed in it. When they saw it could be broken, it stopped being power. Eric was standing outside his father's house when the first threat came. A black SUV idled across the street, its engine humming low. A warning. Clarence stepped onto the porch, shotgun resting against his shoulder. "Looks like they know you're here." Eric nodded. "Good." Clarence exhaled slowly. "You sure about this, son?" Eric's eyes never left the SUV. "Yeah, I'm sure." A pause. Then Clarence said, "All right. Then let's remind them who they're dealing with." The SUV's headlights flickered once before it pulled away, disappearing into the night. Eric smiled. Game on. Part 8. The final standoff. Eric versus Sheriff Burke. The town of Bridgetown was waking up to a storm, but it hadn't yet realized just how devastating it would be. Eric Hayes had been back for less than 48 hours, and already the cracks in the system were starting to show. Fear had shifted. It was no longer his father, Clarence, who felt it. It wasn't the small business owners who had been bullied into silence. It was the men who had run this town unchecked for years. The men who had grown comfortable in their corruption, believing they were untouchable. But untouchable was an illusion. Eric knew that better than anyone. Burke and Reynolds had built their power on intimidation, on the unspoken rule that no one dared challenge them. But fear only worked when people believed resistance was hopeless. The moment someone stood up, the moment someone fought back, that fear turned to uncertainty. And uncertainty was the first step toward collapse. Eric didn't need to rush. He had spent years dismantling threats like this, warlords overseas, corrupt officials who had traded in the lives of their people. This was no different. Bridgetown was just another battlefield. The weapons were different, but the rules were the same. Cut off the head, and the body collapses. He sat in the dimly lit motel room he had been using as his base of operations, eyes scanning the screen of his laptop. Lacey's flash drive had been invaluable, but it was only the beginning. He had spent hours combing through financial records, police logs, and hidden transactions. The deeper he dug, the worse it got. Bridgetown PD wasn't just extorting business owners. They were running a full-scale operation, civil asset forfeiture scams, falsified reports that allowed them to seize property, drug money that never made it into evidence lockers. And at the center of it all was Burke. Reynolds was a thug, a man who enjoyed wielding power over others because it made him feel important. But Burke was the architect. He was the one who had turned corruption into a business, the one who had made sure that no investigation ever got too close. Until now. Eric's phone buzzed. "Maya." "You're making waves," she said the moment he answered. "That was the idea." She sighed. "Burke is scrambling. He's already reached out to his contacts at the state level. He's trying to get ahead of this." Eric leaned back in his chair. "Then we make sure he doesn't." "Eric," Maya said, voice lower now. "There's something you should know. Burke isn't just running a racket. He's connected to Rollins." Eric's jaw tightened. "The senator?" "Yeah. Rollins has been using Bridgetown PD as a personal enforcement squad. Anyone who gets in his way, Burke takes care of it. That's why every time someone tried to investigate, it got shut down before it could go anywhere. Burke isn't just answering to himself." Eric exhaled slowly. This changed things. Taking down Burke wasn't just about exposing a corrupt cop anymore. It was about pulling down a system of protection that stretched all the way to the state capitol. "How high does it go?" he asked. "High enough that you need to be careful," Maya warned. "If Rollins realizes you're coming for him, he won't play defense. He'll hit first." "Let him try." Eric ended the call and closed his laptop. He already knew what his next move was. Burke had spent years ensuring that he never got caught with dirty money in his own accounts. But Eric had found something better. A weakness. Burke didn't keep his leverage in a bank. He kept it in people. Specifically, a man named Thomas Greer. Greer was a retired judge, one who had spent decades bending the law to accommodate men like Burke. Now he was enjoying his retirement on a hefty pension, one that was being supplemented by regular payments from community outreach funds. Eric had traced the money. It was clean enough on the surface, but the deposits lined up too perfectly with key cases being thrown out, evidence going missing, witnesses recanting their statements. Greer was Burke's insurance policy. He was the one who made sure that no real consequences ever landed at the sheriff's doorstep. And tonight, Eric was going to have a conversation with him. It was nearly midnight when he pulled up outside Greer's home. The old man lived in a gated community on the outskirts of town, a quiet little place filled with people who had spent their careers ensuring they never had to answer for their crimes. Eric walked through the front yard like he belonged there, climbed the steps, and knocked once on the heavy oak door. It took a moment, but eventually the porch light flickered on. The door cracked open just enough for Greer's face to appear. "Do you know what time it is?" the old judge grumbled. Eric didn't answer. He pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. Greer stumbled back, eyes widening. "Who the hell do you think you—" Eric shut the door behind him. "We need to talk." Greer's mouth opened, probably to yell for security, but then his eyes locked onto Eric's expression. Something about it must have told him that yelling wouldn't help, because he swallowed whatever words he had been about to say. "I know who you are," the judge muttered. "Then you know why I'm here." Greer exhaled slowly, stepping toward his bar and pouring himself a drink. His hands were steady, but Eric could see the tension in his shoulders. "You think you're the first person to try to come after Burke?" the judge said, taking a sip of his whiskey. "You think you're the first fool to think they can take him down?" Eric didn't move. "Number. But I'll be the last." The judge chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't get it. Burke doesn't lose. Not really. He adjusts. He adapts. And when people like you start making noise, he makes them disappear." Eric took a slow step closer. "You mean like my father?" Greer hesitated. That moment of hesitation was enough. "You have a choice," Eric continued. "You can go down with him, or you can give me everything I need." The judge was silent for a long time. Then he sighed, set his glass down, and walked over to his desk. He opened a drawer, pulled out a manila folder, and tossed it onto the table between them. "You want everything? There it is." Eric opened the folder. Inside were documents, signed agreements, financial ledgers, handwritten notes from Burke himself. Everything. "This is your insurance policy," Eric said. "It was," Greer corrected. "Now it's yours." Eric closed the folder. "If you warn Burke—" "I won't," Greer said, shaking his head. "I'm done playing his game." Eric studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then stay out of my way." He left without another word. By the time the sun rose, Burke's empire was already beginning to crumble. The files had been sent to every journalist in the state. The walls were closing in, and Burke knew it. Eric didn't expect him to surrender. Men like Burke never did. But that was fine. He wasn't here to give Burke a way out. He was here to make sure there wasn't one. Part 9. The Truth Goes Public. The Power of Exposure. Darryl stood quietly in the crowded grocery store aisle, his fingers gently tracing the edge of a cereal box, lost in thought. The mundane hum of shoppers weaving through narrow aisles created a comforting background noise, a quiet tapestry of ordinary life. But that peacefulness shattered in an instant, replaced by words that sliced deeper than any blade ever could. "Why don't you just go back to Africa?" The voice was aged, emboldened by years of entitlement. An elderly white woman, her expression twisted in a bitter mask, glared defiantly at him. The words hung in the air, sharp and jagged, disrupting the comforting hum of routine. The entire aisle froze, suspended in a painful moment. Heads turned, eyes widened, yet no one spoke. Daryl's heart pounded in his chest, his fingers momentarily clenching around the cereal box before he forced himself to breathe, slow and steady. Anger rose first, a familiar anger, one he had swallowed countless times before, but quickly, something deeper surged beneath it. Sorrow. Sorrow at the ignorance that persisted, sorrow for those who still chose hatred over understanding. For a brief instant, he considered walking away, as he had done many times before. The easy route, the path of least resistance. But as he stood there, his mother's voice echoed in his memory, clear as if she stood right beside him again. "Baby, when they try to push you down, you stand taller. Never let their ignorance shrink who you are." Daryl exhaled slowly, carefully placed the box back on the shelf, and turned to face the woman. She had already turned away, smugly confident she had made her point. He spoke gently, but with a quiet strength that carried through the silent store. "Ma'am," he said, each word measured and thoughtful, "I've lived my entire life here in America. My parents did too. My grandparents marched through streets filled with hatred, peacefully demanding nothing more than to be treated equally, as Americans. So, when you tell me to go back, I wonder, do you realize that Africa was taken from my ancestors long ago? Do you understand that America, with all her flaws and beauty, has always been my home?" She spun back around, startled. Clearly, she had not expected him to respond, especially not so calmly. Her eyes narrowed, her lips trembling slightly as she searched for something more hurtful to say. But before she could find the words, Daryl continued softly. "You see, I carry Africa in my veins, a proud heritage that was stolen from my people generations ago. But America is etched deeply in my heart, a nation my ancestors built, quite literally brick by brick, often without recognition or respect. So when you say, 'go back,' I must ask you, go back where? To an ancestral land I never knew, or to a history that America herself still refuses to fully acknowledge?" His voice never rose, but the weight of his words filled the entire store. People from adjacent aisles began gathering around, eyes wide, listening carefully. Daryl took a careful step toward the woman, not threateningly, but with gentle conviction. "Every time I hear those words, they remind me of the generations of suffering my family endured, just to exist. They remind me of my grandmother, who cooked in a diner she wasn't even allowed to eat in. They remind me of my grandfather, a veteran who fought bravely for a country that treated him as less than human when he returned. They remind me of how far we've come, but also ho the wum. He's right." The another voice spoke up, a woman holding a SA murmur rippled. Daryl saw the "I don't," her eyes glisten. The older gentleman, Daryl, nodded humbly. "If we don't face it head on, it just grows stronger in the shadows. Somebody has to speak up." "You did well," the man smiled, sincerity clear in his eyes. "You made this whole store a better place today." As the man turned to leave, Daryl stood alone again, feeling the weight of the moment finally settling on him. He wondered briefly if his words had truly reached her, if perhaps she'd rethink the assumptions she had held so deeply. Change wasn't easy, he knew, but every small step mattered. Every conversation, every moment of courage and truth, slowly chipped away at ignorance, slowly tore down barriers. It was a battle he would fight again and again, as long as necessary, not with anger or bitterness, but with patience, dignity, and compassion. Because that was the legacy his ancestors had passed down to him, a legacy not just of struggle, but of hope, of belief that the world could be better, fairer, kinder, even if it required uncomfortable truths along the way. As Daryl picked up the cereal box once again, now symbolizing a moment of courage rather than routine. He felt a quiet pride. Maybe the fight against prejudice wasn't measured in grand victories, but in tiny moments just like this. Moments when silence broke, understanding deepened, and hearts softened. He made his way to the checkout, feeling the store's familiar hum returning. But now, woven into that hum, was a new sense of possibility. Because today, for at least a few hearts, the world had shifted ever so slightly toward understanding. Daryl smiled softly, holding tight to the belief that one voice truly could make a difference. Part 10. The Real Enemy. Alan Pierce's Exposure. Eric Hayes had always believed that the gravest threats lurked on distant shores, in war-torn territories where he led covert operations against warlords and insurgents. He never imagined that the most perilous battle of his life would unfold on American soil, in the very country he had sworn to protect. Yet there he was, standing outside a rundown warehouse in the dead of night, the faint glow of neon from a nearby motel flickering across the wet asphalt. Somewhere inside that warehouse, a man named Senator Lionel Rawlins was plotting his final gambit, backed by a powerful ally deep in the Department of Homeland Security, Deputy Director Alan Pierce. Together, they had orchestrated a campaign of intimidation, corruption, and brutality in Bridgetown. Now, they were taking desperate measures to protect themselves. Eric couldn't let that happen. It had been only hours since the entire system threatened to crush Eric and his father, Clarence Hayes, for daring to expose the rotten core of law enforcement in their hometown. Clarence, a Vietnam veteran and small business owner, had become a target for local police extortion. Eric, a decorated Delta Force operative, had returned to free his father and tear down the network of corruption. But what started as a battle against a local sheriff soon revealed a deeper conspiracy. Rawlins, a polished, ambitious senator, and Pierce, an entrenched DHS official, were the twin pillars holding up an empire built on fear. With each step Eric took, he discovered more evidence that a national security apparatus was being leveraged to silence American citizens. Now, everything he valued, family, freedom, even his own life, was on the line. Earlier that evening, Eric had left his father in the safety of an old friend's farmhouse. Despite Clarence's protests, Eric insisted that he tackle this last phase alone. They had already faced a terrifying raid orchestrated by men in unmarked vehicles, men who answered not to local officials, but to Pierce himself. The objective had been clear: eliminate Eric, or frame him so completely that no one would question the official narrative. But Eric had survived, aided by a small circle of allies, including Maya Reynolds, a Department of Justice contact who risked her career to supply Eric with vital intel. With her help, Eric discovered the final location: an abandoned industrial zone where Rawlins and Pierce's men were planning their last stand. They needed to tie up every loose end, destroy every piece of evidence, and vanish into the labyrinth of federal bureaucracy. If they succeeded, no one would ever hold them accountable. Standing in the shadows, Eric listened to the muffled voices drifting from inside the warehouse. Rain began to fall in light taps against the corrugated metal roof. He remembered the last conversation he had with Maya. "They're cornered," she had said, her voice tight with concern. "Cornered animals fight hardest. Rawlins has direct lines to half the intelligence community. Pierce can manipulate entire case files at the touch of a button. You're not just walking into a gunfight, you're walking into a system designed to protect them." Eric had replied with a simple, "Then I'll tear the system down." Now, the time had come to back up that statement. Moving with the silent grace honed through countless missions, Eric slipped around the perimeter. He placed small cylindrical devices near the exits, non-lethal charges that would scramble electronics, jam signals, and leave the inside vulnerable. The wind carried the faint smell of rust and decay, reminders that this industrial zone had long been forgotten by legitimate enterprises, making it a perfect spot for clandestine dealings. He checked his watch. Less than 15 minutes until Maya activated the Black Ops drone overhead. They needed visual confirmation of how many men guarded Rawlins, how many mercenaries Pierce had sent. A crackle of static in Eric's earpiece signaled that Maya was patching through. "I've got partial visuals," she whispered, her voice subdued, as though she feared the walls could hear her. Multiple heat signatures, at least 8 heavily armed. Another set near the northwest corner, possibly 4 more. Rollins is inside, 2nd floor. No sign of Pierce physically, but I'm reading strong comm signals. He's orchestrating this from a remote site, probably within DHS's network. Eric nodded to himself, scanning the building's structure. The main door was heavily guarded, but a side entry seemed less fortified. That was likely where the real watchers stood, trusting the environment's labyrinth-like layout to deter infiltration. But Eric had never been deterred by labyrinths. He slid around a row of old oil drums, ignoring the faint stench of chemical rot that burned his nostrils. Another crackle in his ear. Maya again. I'm reading an unexpected heat source in the basement. Possibly a captive. Could be someone they want to leverage. Eric's stomach twisted at the thought. Maybe a journalist, or another insider who had stumbled too close to the truth. He inhaled, steadied himself, and advanced. Gunfire shattered the quiet. Short bursts echoed through the night, and Eric dropped to a crouch, scanning for muzzle flashes. It's the outer perimeter, Maya hissed in his ear. They've spotted movement. Probably local cops on Rollins' payroll or more of Pierce's men. Eric cursed under his breath. The one advantage he had was surprise, and if some incompetent minion triggered a firefight early, the entire plan could unravel. He needed to move now. He darted to the side entrance, pressing his back against the cool metal. A single guard, slouched and bored, held an assault rifle at the ready, but appeared more concerned with the phone in his hand. Classic overconfidence. In one fluid motion, Eric lunged, hooking the man's rifle and driving an elbow into his throat. The guard crumpled, unconscious, before he could even register what had happened. Gently, Eric set the man's rifle aside, then placed one of the jamming devices by the doorway and keyed his earpiece. Activating Phase 1, he whispered. Maya, drop the signals. High above, a specialized drone triggered a local comms blackout, courtesy of some advanced technology that Maya had borrowed from the Justice Department's Black Ops stockpile. Inside the warehouse, any phone or radio within range would screech with static, severing Rollins' connection to Pierce. With that, Eric entered. The corridors were dimly lit by flickering fluorescent tubes. The air felt stale, heavy with dust, and the echo of machinery that hadn't run in years. Yet there was a tension, like the building itself was holding its breath. Carefully, Eric moved along the walls, pistol raised, ears tuned for any sign of the heavily armed men. He heard a voice first, low, commanding, certain of its power. We hold position until Pierce gives the order, the voice said. Another man responded, agitated. How do we contact him with no comms? Something's not right. The first voice hissed a reply, but Eric didn't wait to hear it. He took advantage of the confusion, slipping past an open doorway. Past the corner, 2 men stood with rifles, scanning the corridor. They had no idea how close he was. Without comms, they couldn't even warn each other properly. Eric stepped behind the first man, hooking his arm around the man's throat and pulling him backward. The second man turned, eyes wide, but Eric used the first guard's body as a shield, preventing a clear shot. A swift strike later, both guards were down, left in a silent heap. Efficiency was key. This wasn't about body counts, but about removing obstacles quickly. He advanced up a set of creaking metal stairs, the stale smell intensifying. The second floor was an expanse of rusted catwalks and broken windows, letting in thin slivers of moonlight. Voices drifted across from the far side. "Stay calm," said the same authoritative voice. "He can't take us all." Then came a calmer, more refined tone. "Senator Rollins. Don't underestimate that man," he warned. He took down half of Burke's men without blinking. Eric smirked in the darkness. So they were rattled. Good. Fear was a powerful weapon. He slid behind a stack of crates, glimpsing the small group. 4 men with assault rifles, and Rollins standing behind them, arms folded, trying to project an air of confidence. Another figure cowered near Rollins's side, a local official Eric vaguely recognized, perhaps an accountant or clerk coerced into forging documents. The man's face was twisted with dread. Eric counted the seconds in his head, listening to the men shift restlessly. Then he made his move. He hurled a small flashbang across the floor, turning away just before the device exploded in a burst of blinding light and deafening sound. Shouts filled the air, gunfire erupting in wild, panicked arcs. Eric sprang forward, taking advantage of their disorientation. He dropped low, sweeping the legs of the nearest guard, disarming him before the man could even see straight. A quick pivot and a sharp elbow incapacitated the second guard. Bullets hissed overhead, punching into crates and sending splinters flying. Amid the chaos, Rollins stumbled backward. He fired a pistol blindly, the muzzle flash lighting his own terrified expression. Eric lunged, striking the pistol from Rollins' hand. The senator gasped, stepping back into a patch of moonlight that illuminated the fear in his eyes. He was cornered. The last guard, now recovered, aimed at Eric, but the local official tackled him in a burst of unexpected courage. The shot went wide, embedding into the far wall. Panting, Eric pressed the senator against a metal beam. "You tried to kill my father, destroyed lives, blackmailed officials, all for your empire. Where's your power now?" Rollins glared, trying to regain his composure. "You fool," he spat. "Pierce is unstoppable. I'm just a piece on the board." Eric shook his head slowly. Not anymore. Before Rollins could speak again, footsteps thundered up the stairs. This time it was a different group of men, federal agents, their badges glinting in the moonlight. Maya had come through. She had directed the rightful authorities to the precise location, ensuring the final confrontation would be witnessed by those with legitimate authority. One agent commanded, "Freeze! Hands up!" Eric stepped back, letting Rollins stand alone in the flickering half-light. The senator's shirt was torn, sweat glistening on his brow, all his arrogance spent. He raised his hands slowly, eyes darting around as if searching for some last-minute escape. But there was none. The men who had served him were scattered, unconscious or otherwise subdued. And in the corner, the local official cowered, tears streaming down his face, relieved that the nightmare might finally be over. A voice came from behind Eric. "We've got it from here," said the lead federal agent, a tall woman with the calm, steeled gaze of someone who had seen it all. She flicked a glance at Eric. "We'll detain him and gather official testimony. This time, there's no throwing out the evidence, no hush money. I've already got a direct line to the Attorney General, who's been watching the entire fiasco unfold." Eric gave a short nod, stepping aside, chest still heaving from the exertion. Rollins was cuffed, his eyes reflecting a potent mix of fury and humiliation. For the first time, the man who had orchestrated so many silent tragedies was speechless. The agent turned to Eric. "We've had eyes on you from the moment you set foot in Bridgetown. Some of us wanted to intervene sooner, but you were always 3 steps ahead. Now that we have him, you should know Pierce is next." Eric exhaled, the tension in his muscles finally easing. He brushed off the dust and debris from his jacket. "I'm counting on it," he said, voice steady but devoid of triumph. "This was never about revenge. I just wanted it to end." The agent nodded, respecting the quiet stoicism in Eric's demeanor. "We have enough to make sure neither Rollins nor anyone above him walks away. And your father, he's in the clear. The entire fiasco that led to his arrest has been exposed." Eric's gaze slid to the starlit sky beyond the broken windows. He thought of Clarence, of the weariness in his father's eyes that no measure of justice would fully erase. But at least now, the man could breathe without the weight of a target on his back. "Thank you," Eric said softly, turning to leave. The agent offered him a subtle salute, an unspoken acknowledgement of everything he had done. For a moment, time seemed to stand still in that warehouse. The weight of so many secrets finally lifted into the open air. Outside, the night felt clearer, the air somehow cleaner. Sirens wailed in the distance as more vehicles approached, shining bright beams across the warehouse lot. Eric moved away from the commotion, each step echoing in the hush that followed the chaos. The final showdown with Rollins was over, but he knew the fight wasn't truly done. Pierce remained, lurking in the highest echelons of power, a puppet master who had nearly destroyed everything Eric held dear. Yet, for tonight at least, a measure of justice had been served. The man who had threatened his father's life, who had used his position to destroy anyone who opposed him, was in cuffs. And if the system functioned as it should, this time there would be no escape. Eric climbed into his car, ignoring the throbbing ache in his shoulder from a near-miss bullet. He started the engine, letting out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He glanced at his phone. A single text from Clarence. "You okay, son?" Eric smiled, heart heavy with exhaustion but buoyed by relief. He typed back, "We're okay, Dad." He's gone. The phone buzzed again, this time from Maya. "Next step is Pierce. Let's bring him down." Eric's fingers hovered over the screen, an understanding creeping through him that they were on a path from which there was no return. He typed back a single word. "Always." He slipped the phone into his pocket, headlights slicing through the darkness as he drove away. The morning sun would rise soon, casting its light on a bridge town that might, for the first time in decades, wake up without the shadow of men like Rollins dictating everyone's fate. People would learn that justice wasn't just an empty word. It could be claimed, fought for, and won, even if the cost was high. Eric pressed on the gas, the warehouse shrinking in his rearview mirror. He knew Pierce was out there, a puppet master still clutching his strings. But Eric was ready. If toppling Rollins had taught him anything, it was that no matter how powerful the enemy seemed, one person with enough determination, and the truth on their side, could change the outcome of the entire game. He thought of Clarence, his father's unwavering belief that a single voice, properly raised, could silence the cacophony of oppression. He thought of every small step that had led to this grand confrontation. And he promised himself that the flame lit by this night's victory would not die until the last piece of corruption was turned to ash. The sun's earliest rays began to paint the horizon. Eric let out a breath. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the magnitude of what had happened. A senator in chains, a father vindicated, a community beginning to find its voice. He had not done it alone, but together with people who refused to let fear define them. He drove on, the road ahead stretching wide with possibilities. He had no illusions that the battle was finished. Pierce was still out there, a final boss lurking in the shadows of government might. But for the first time in a very long while, Eric felt hope. Because even in the darkest corners of corruption, truth had a way of finding its path to light. And he, Eric Hayes, would not stop until every last corridor of power was forced to acknowledge that truth. Part 11. The Escape and Pursuit. The hunter becomes the hunted. Malcolm Reeves had always believed that justice, like a ship navigating stormy seas, required both a steady hand at the helm and an unshakable sense of direction. Throughout his career, he had steered countless cases through the rough waters of public opinion and the hidden reefs of corruption. But now, standing beneath the vaulted ceiling of a grand courtroom, he felt the weight of his own words and actions converging into a single, fateful moment. The echoes of what had transpired, his unlawful detention at the hands of Officer Rebecca Sloan, the subsequent trial, and the fervent public outcry, lingered in the hush that enveloped the space. There had been a time not too long ago when Malcolm would have trusted the system to correct its own errors, believing that people were inherently good, that fairness prevailed more often than it failed. But a split second in the darkness, with a gun aimed squarely at him, had shattered that comfortable illusion. He had been forced to confront a painful truth. There were cracks in the foundation, fractures no one wanted to speak about, yet they threatened the entire structure if left unaddressed. He surveyed the spectators filling the wooden benches. Some were allies, others were critics, and many were simply curious onlookers, drawn by the media frenzy surrounding a judge who had dared to press charges against the very officers meant to uphold the law. At the far end of the front row sat a small group of civil rights advocates, their faces etched with anticipation and quiet hope. Near them, a cluster of uniformed officers sat with rigid postures, their gazes marked by a mix of defiance and simmering doubt. Malcolm knew none of them expected an easy outcome. Officer Sloan's misconduct had ignited a blaze that could no longer be contained by polite excuses. The The trial had been quicker than anyone anticipated, with the evidence stacking up like stones in an avalanche. Body cam footage, eyewitness statements, even the viral video captured by a bystander. It all painted a damning portrait of power abused and prejudice worn so casually that it chilled the soul. Yet Malcolm had seen time and again how even the strongest evidence could be twisted or trivialized by those who refused to confront the uncomfortable. This time, however, the court of public opinion had already reached its verdict. Now, the official gavel needed to match that thunderous condemnation. Malcolm inhaled deeply, feeling the tension coiled in the air as Officer Sloan was brought in by bailiffs. She wore civilian clothes, her once confident posture diminished. There was no uniform to lean on now, no shield of authority. This was simply a woman who had let prejudice guide her to a point of no return. She kept her chin tilted upward, as though refusing to concede any hint of remorse. But the tremor in her hands told another story. Malcolm recognized that tremor. He had seen it on defendants who knew there was no escape from the consequences of their actions. He looked toward the bench, where Judge Eleanor Hayes presided with the composed authority that Malcolm himself used to embody. She caught his eye briefly, offering a subtle, understanding nod, then turned to address the court. The hush deepened as her gavel struck once, sharp and clear. "This court calls the case of the state versus Rebecca Sloan," Judge Hayes announced, her gaze sweeping over both prosecution and defense. "We have weighed the evidence and arguments presented. Are we ready for the verdict?" A low murmur rippled through the room. The prosecutor, a relentless woman named Felicia Ward, stood with a poised clarity that had served her well throughout the trial. She had outlined the charges with surgical precision: misuse of power, intimidation, racial profiling, and assault. The defense had scrambled for mitigating circumstances, anything to paint Sloan as overworked, stressed, or unsure, but the facts refused to bend under their attempts. Malcolm cast a sidelong glance at Sloan's attorney, a man who had once claimed the system was fair to all. Now, his shoulders sagged under the realization that words alone could not reshape the glaring truth laid out in recordings and testimonies. He offered his client a short, powerless shrug. Sloan, her eyes set, braced for the inevitability about to fall upon her. Judge Hayes took a moment, scanning the gallery with measured calm, as though assessing the collective heartbeat of the room. Then she turned her attention to the jury foreperson, a man in his early 40s who wore the tense expression of someone about to deliver heavy news. "Foreperson, have you reached a verdict?" the judge inquired. The man stood, cleared his throat, and spoke with firm clarity. "On the charge of abuse of authority, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of racially motivated misconduct, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of intimidation and undue use of force, we find the defendant guilty." Silence, taut and breathless, clenched the room. Sloan's face paled, and she tensed, as though her body might collapse under the burden of that single word. Guilty. A hush of collective exhalation passed through the spectators, a subtle wave of relief and reflection. Malcolm felt the release of tension in his own chest, an emotional storm he had learned to contain. Yet here it was, threatening to spill over. He managed to maintain the same composed exterior he had always shown in court, even though inside he felt an unexpected mix of vindication and sadness. "This is not the end," Sloan whispered, barely audible, anger glinting in her eyes like a final defiance. Perhaps she believed that some higher hand would intervene, that an appeal or a twist of bureaucratic fate might rescue her from the consequences. But no such rescue came. Judge Hayes nodded to the bailiff to maintain order, then turned to address the court. Officer Sloan's actions were not just a lapse of judgment. They were a deliberate choice to abuse the power given to her by the people. This court takes such offenses with utmost gravity. The system is only as strong as its weakest link, only as fair as the hearts of those who enforce its rules. Today, we reaffirm that no one is above the law. Sloan swallowed hard, her composure finally cracking. The hush in the courtroom grew even heavier, as though the entire space were bracing for what came next. In light of the evidence, Judge Hayes continued. "And with respect to the jury's findings, this court sentences you, Rebecca Sloan, to 2 years of incarceration in a state facility, followed by mandatory community service and a permanent disqualification from any law enforcement position. Further, you will attend a court-supervised program on racial bias and community relations to ensure that the root cause of your actions is acknowledged and addressed." A collective, rippling gasp spread through the room. 2 years. Malcolm knew that for some it wouldn't seem enough. For others, it would be a sign the system had overreached. But for him, it was a statement that accountability was not just a word, that consequences applied even to those who wore the uniform. Sloane's knees buckled slightly, and the bailiff stepped forward, guiding her toward a side exit. As she passed by Malcolm, their eyes briefly locked. He saw in her gaze a swirl of disbelief, anger, and something like betrayal. Perhaps she felt the system she had once believed hers to command had turned against her. Perhaps she realized in that moment that the badge she had worn did not make her untouchable after all. Malcolm's heart pounded. He didn't relish her downfall. This was not a personal triumph. It was a necessary step in restoring faith to a community that had long lived in fear of officers like her. Yet he also felt the sting of empathy. He had devoted his life to justice, to the notion that even those who erred could find redemption if they chose to change. But redemption required humility, and in Sloane's eyes, he saw only bitterness. As the gavel fell, the crowd began to stir. Some people rushed outside to relay the verdict to the reporters waiting on the courthouse steps. Others lingered, approaching Malcolm with hushed words of gratitude or relief. One woman, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, touched his arm gently and whispered, "Thank you. My son was also pulled over once, just like you, but he didn't have the title of judge to protect him. Maybe now, fewer mothers will have to fear for their children." Malcolm nodded, emotion catching in his throat. He offered a small, understanding smile, wishing he had the power to do more. Still, it was a step, a sign that maybe, just maybe, the fortress of prejudice had begun to crack. Outside, the media frenzy was already in full swing, microphones pointed at faces raw with emotion, flashes illuminating the scene as though it were a premiere of a new film. But this wasn't fiction. This was a real, hard-fought victory for truth. A reminder that while the system might be flawed, it wasn't beyond redemption. He passed through the doors into the bright afternoon sun, blinking as the light momentarily blinded him. A wave of reporters converged, firing questions from every angle. "Judge Reeves, how do you feel about the sentence? Do you believe justice was truly served? Is this a turning point for systemic reform?" Malcolm raised a hand calmly, a silent request for space. Slowly, the clamor subsided enough for him to speak. "I don't celebrate the downfall of any individual," he said, measuring each word. Officer Sloane's actions were wrong, and the court recognized that. This is not about punishing one person. It's about reminding every officer, every public servant, that they are accountable to the people they serve. We must ensure that the next time someone is pulled over, they don't have to fear for their life based on the color of their skin. He scanned the crowd, acknowledging the many voices, some supportive, some skeptical. "Justice," he continued, "is not an endpoint. It's a commitment we renew every day. If we stop fighting, we lose ground. This is just one verdict, one step. There's still a long road ahead." With that, he stepped away, leaving the cameras and reporters behind. He felt the warm press of his phone in his pocket, remembering the messages of support he had received from strangers, from people in far-off places who saw his story and recognized their own. Perhaps that was the silent truth behind all this turmoil. The fight for justice was larger than any one town, any single act. It was an ongoing struggle requiring each generation to pick up the torch from the last. He descended the courthouse steps, weaving past the throng of onlookers, ignoring the reporters' new barrage of questions. His mind drifted to that night, the red and blue lights strobing, the chill in the air as he was forced out of his car at gunpoint, the disbelief that an officer could see him not as a judge, not as a man, but as a threat. In sentencing Sloane, The court had also sent a message that such cruelty could not stand unchallenged. But was that enough to transform a culture? Enough to warn the next officer who might believe a gun and a badge endowed them with unassailable power? Time would tell. But Malcolm Reeves walked away with a sense of purpose rekindled. He would continue presiding over cases, ensuring that in his courtroom, at least, every voice mattered and every fact was heard. He would speak at law schools, community events, anywhere people would listen, spreading the gospel that justice demanded vigilance, empathy, and unrelenting courage. And he would never forget the weight of handcuffs against his wrists, a reminder that no one was truly safe unless everyone was. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the city streets. Yet Malcolm found himself embracing that twilight, seeing it not as an end, but as a threshold. Somewhere in those shadows, prejudice still lurked, searching for a moment of weakness. He would not grant it that opportunity. He had faced it once, forced it into the public eye, and come out the other side. Now it was time to use this moment, this ruling, as a catalyst for deeper change. Slipping behind the wheel of his own car, one he could drive freely now, without a sense of dread creeping at the edges of his consciousness, he started the engine. As the motor purred, he glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror. There was weariness in his eyes, yes, but also something else, a spark that hadn't been there before. Resolve, hope, and a promise to himself that the next generation would not have to fear the sight of flashing lights for the color of their skin. He drove off into the dwindling daylight, the city's noise receding behind him. In the distance, sirens sang their usual tune, echoing the city's ceaseless hum. This time, though, the sound did not tighten his chest. This time, it reminded him that victory, fragile, incomplete, but oh so important, was possible. And if it was possible once, perhaps it could be repeated, until intimidation gave way to respect, until prejudice bowed to equality, and until the day came that no one, under any circumstances, would have to fear the misuse of a badge ever again. Part 12. The Final Move. Confronting the True Masters of Corruption. Malcolm Reeves walked slowly through the polished marble corridors of the courthouse, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. In every reflection on the gleaming surfaces, he caught his own image, a reminder of the path that had brought him here. He had once believed the law was a majestic shield, unbreakable, protecting the vulnerable and punishing the unjust. But now he knew better. The law was only as strong as the people who wielded it, and sometimes those people turned the shield into a weapon. Tonight, the courthouse was nearly empty, except for a few weary clerks and security personnel. The day's final hearing had concluded an hour ago, but Malcolm had lingered, drawn to these halls by a mixture of residual anger and a quiet, persistent hope. He paused outside a courtroom where a plaque read, "Equal Justice Under Law." His fingers traced the letters, and he recalled the moment that had nearly stripped him of that illusion. Officer Rebecca Sloan aiming a gun at his chest, sneering as though his life were a trivial matter. That memory still pricked at the corners of his mind. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing through the wave of frustration and grief. He remembered the confusion in her eyes when she realized he was a judge, as though her presumption of guilt had been so deeply ingrained that any other reality was inconceivable. Malcolm couldn't forget the swirl of humiliation he'd felt. His entire career had been devoted to ensuring fairness, yet even wearing a judicial robe couldn't shield him from prejudice. No title could erase the color of his skin in the eyes of someone bent on wielding power as a cudgel. And so he had pressed charges, triggering a firestorm of public scrutiny that pulled the entire city into a fervent debate about policing, race, and accountability. As the weeks unfolded, the trial against Sloan had exposed a labyrinth of lesser offenses, a pattern of minor stops and petty humiliations inflicted on countless individuals who didn't have Malcolm's visibility or resources. The city erupted in protests, half the population outraged that an officer could behave so brazenly, the other half insisting that she had simply made a mistake while doing her duty. News vans choked downtown streets, and social media buzzed with hashtags demanding justice or disclaiming abuse of power. Malcolm, caught in the eye of the storm, tried to remain calm, tried to focus on the universal principles he'd long championed: honesty, evidence, the right to a fair process. But beneath that calm exterior, a war raged within him. He felt a moral imperative to ensure that no one else would endure the horror of an officer's gun pointed at their heart simply for existing. The trial had been swift. He'd testified with unwavering composure, describing every detail: her approach to his vehicle, her disregard for his explanations, her belittling remarks, and finally the chilling moment she drew her weapon. Surveillance footage from a nearby storefront captured crucial angles, confirming that Malcolm had done nothing except question the legality of the stop. Body cam evidence revealed a pattern. She had often escalated minor encounters into menacing confrontations, particularly when the person she stopped was black. Sloane's defense counsel struggled to justify her actions, pointing to stress, an overburdened force, the hazard of night shifts, anything that might elicit sympathy. Yet the jury saw through the excuses. They saw a person who had let prejudice override reason. When the verdict was read, guilty on multiple counts of misconduct, Malcolm felt only a measured relief, not triumph. He watched as the bailiff approached Sloane with handcuffs, and a pang of empathy stirred in him. She looked small then, robbed of the uniform's authority, her face etched with a realization that she had destroyed her own future. Yet empathy did not erase accountability. This wasn't personal vengeance. It was the law being upheld in the rare instance when evidence was too clear to deny. What followed next was a city grappling with its conscience. The trial had forced open a door on decades of silent complicity. Citizens came forward with their own stories of intimidation, petty humiliations, or brazen racial profiling. Some cops felt betrayed by one of their own and demanded internal reforms. Others closed ranks, claiming outsiders, like the judge, were stirring chaos. Vigils were held outside the courthouse, candles flickering in the dusk as names of those who had faced similar abuse without recourse were read aloud. Malcolm attended one such vigil in secret, standing behind the crowd, listening to tearful testimonies from parents, siblings, and friends who had lost faith in the uniform sworn to protect them. His friend, Chief Justice Daniela Parker, reached out with a gentle but urgent plea. "Malcolm, you can't bear the world's burdens by yourself. Let the system do its job." He responded with a quiet, ironic smile. "The system is precisely what put me in handcuffs that night." She had sighed, telling him that systemic change required patience. But Malcolm had seen too many heartbreaks, heard too many pleas from individuals who believed in a system that often turned its back when they needed it most. Patience, to him, felt like a delay tactic for those already comfortable. The public response galvanized people across the country. A wave of support arrived via letters, emails, and messages from individuals who had never met him but recognized their own experiences in his ordeal. Civil rights organizations praised his courage for pressing charges, insisting that more legal professionals should follow suit, shining a light on the hidden corners of law enforcement. Yet, some critics labeled him a troublemaker or an opportunist, claiming he was waging a personal vendetta. Malcolm tried not to let either group define him. He remained firm, anchored by the principle that no one, judge or not, deserved to face a gun simply because of a traffic stop. As the appeals process began for Sloane, Malcolm faced another challenge: forging a path forward. The guilty verdict was a single case among countless injustices. If the city believed that punishing one officer cleansed the entire department, real reform would never happen. So he used his platform. He spoke at community forums, addressing officers and residents alike. With measured clarity, he recounted his story not as a vendetta, but as a cautionary tale, urging everyone to examine their biases and the subtle ways bigotry could seep into daily interactions. He worked with local officials to propose an oversight committee, one that had real teeth, real authority to investigate allegations of misconduct. He wanted to ensure that evidence never again got buried under official indifference, that citizens wouldn't need the high rank of a federal judge to have their voices heard. The pushback was immediate. Anonymous threats arrived in his mailbox, telling him to stay in his lane or risk losing everything. But for every hate-filled letter, 10 more arrived, offering gratitude, personal stories, pleas for him not to back down. Malcolm realized that even in the darkness, there was a fervent, unstoppable desire for change. The city found itself at a crossroads. Some in law enforcement saw him as a traitor, undermining their authority. Others recognized an opportunity for healing and accountability. Community leaders, teachers, pastors, and youth groups rallied behind him, organizing meetings with city council members, drafting policy changes, and refusing to let the conversation fade. Late one evening, Malcolm met with a small group of veteran officers who believed in the uniform's integrity. He stood in a cramped municipal building basement, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. They told him stories of attempts to confront prejudiced colleagues and how often they were silenced by superiors. They described a culture that punished them if they spoke out, labeling them disloyal. Malcolm listened intently. The cracks were everywhere, but in that basement, he realized how many good people were also longing for change. The final turning point arrived when the city council, swayed by the groundswell of public engagement, voted to create an independent civilian review board. It would have the power to subpoena officers, examine body cam footage, and recommend disciplinary actions. Many were skeptical about whether it would truly function or succumb to the same bureaucratic inertia. Yet, for the first time, Malcolm felt a glimmer of optimism. A single conviction had led to a bigger conversation, a collective admission that the shadows needed light. On a crisp morning, he stood outside the courthouse steps, addressing reporters who had followed the story from the beginning. He spoke without rancor, but with unyielding determination. "Justice," he said, voice echoing against the marble pillars, "is more than a verdict or a sentence. It's an ongoing process that demands our continued vigilance. We cannot settle for punishing one officer and then turning our backs on the structures that allowed that officer's actions to go unchecked. This moment is our chance to reshape the very foundation on which we stand." The assembled crowd watched him with a kind of reverent intensity. Some held homemade signs. "No one above the law. Equality is accountability." In their eyes, Malcolm saw a readiness for something new, a city poised to challenge the old ways. He descended the steps, the press parted like a wave, and he waded through, offering quiet nods to those who reached out to him. Though the path ahead was uncertain and rife with resistance, he carried a resolute calm. He had confronted hatred face to face and had not faltered. Others were stepping forward, finding courage in his stance. That night, he returned to his chambers, sat at his desk, and reflected on what had come to pass. The memory of being forced out of his car at gunpoint still haunted him, a midnight reminder of how quickly one's world could tilt. Yet now, that memory burned with a different glow. It was a testament to how fragile justice could be, and how essential it was to defend it. Setting down the day's notes, he let out a quiet sigh. He was tired, but no longer weary in spirit. For the first time in a long while, he felt hope that real transformation might bloom in the cracks injustice had created. In the solitude of that office, he made a silent vow to remain watchful, to never allow complacency to chip away at the progress they had fought so hard to secure. A single officer had been brought to account, but there were many more like her, in every city, in every rank. This was only the beginning. The story of Judge Malcolm Reeves is not just about one man's fight for justice. It is a reflection of a much deeper struggle embedded within our society. It is the story of every individual who has ever been unfairly judged, every voice that has been silenced, and every injustice that has been ignored for the sake of maintaining a status quo that protects the powerful while oppressing the vulnerable. Malcolm's journey is a testament to the undeniable truth that justice is not a passive ideal. It is an active pursuit requiring courage, resilience, and an unwavering belief in what is right. One of the most important lessons to take from this story is the necessity of accountability. Without it, power becomes a weapon, wielded carelessly by those who believe they are above the very laws they swore to uphold. Malcolm understood that his experience was not unique. It was part of a pattern, a system that allowed unchecked authority to trample the rights of those deemed unworthy of dignity. By standing up and demanding accountability, he forced not only Officer Sloan, but the entire city to confront the reality of institutional bias. Another lesson is the power of persistence. Change does not happen overnight, nor does it come without resistance. Malcolm faced threats, public criticism, and the weight of a system designed to exhaust those who dare challenge it. But he refused to be deterred. He used every resource at his disposal, his position, his voice, and his unwavering sense of justice, to ignite a movement that reached far beyond his own case. His battle was not just about himself. It was about ensuring that the next person pulled over in a routine traffic stop would not have to fear for their life. His fight was for the countless individuals who never received the justice they deserved. This story also serves as a reminder that real change requires collective action. Malcolm may have been at the center of this fight, but he did not win it alone. His allies, the brave officers who spoke out, the citizens who protested, the activists who organized, were all crucial in shifting the tide. It is a reminder to all of us that no matter how insurmountable injustice may seem, when people come together with a shared purpose, they have the power to dismantle even the most entrenched systems of oppression. Perhaps the greatest takeaway from Malcolm's story is that justice must never be assumed. It must be demanded. If history has taught us anything, it is that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. Every step toward progress has been made because someone was willing to challenge the norm, to raise their voice, to stand firm even when standing alone. And that is where we come in. We are not just observers of stories like Malcolm's. We are participants in an ongoing fight for fairness, dignity, and human rights. This fight does not end with one conviction, one policy change, or one courtroom victory. It is a continuous struggle, requiring vigilance, education, and action. It requires us to question authority when necessary, to support those who are wrongfully accused, and to advocate for a system that serves all people equally, not just those in positions of privilege. If this story moved you, if you believe in the fight for justice, if you refuse to accept a world where power goes unchecked, then join us. Subscribe to Civil Rights Fight and be part of a movement that seeks to create real, lasting change. Share this story, start conversations, and take action in your own communities. Because justice is not just a concept, it is a responsibility. And together we can ensure that no one else has to endure what Malcolm did simply because of the color of their skin. Stay informed, stay engaged, stay in the fight. Because justice isn't given, it's fought for.